Chapter 9. The Mists of Sacrum. In the beginning, in the cosmos there was silence. Out of silence came unity. Out of unity came diversity. Diversity created conflict. And out of it, movement was born. And from movement, life. Clarion Cosmogonies, First Volume. Sacrum Peaks. 1346 Imperial Calendar. 22 years before present.
The cliffs on the ridges were open wounds in the rock. The place looked as if it had been torn apart by the claws of some colossal beast. The peaks of those steep mountain ranges continued to rise thousands of feet into the sky. The wind roared with an unearthly fury, raising tides of snow. An ocean of falling snow obscured the view ahead of them like a thick blanket of mist. The riders moved at a slow pace, hunched over and protected by several layers of fur to shield them from the inhuman cold. In the vanguard, a large force of northern barbarians advanced on foot in battle formation. Their shields were raised forward, forming a thick wall of metal. It was as if they expected a cavalry charge at any moment. Ra wore the distinctive robes of a monk dedicated to the goddess Kala, although they could not be seen under the bearskins he wore to protect him from the harsh weather. He wore hidden emblems that distinguished him as a reverend. The highest rank in the group of monks who rode alongside him. All of them were servants of his temple. Between them and the group of mercenaries they had hired rode an unsettling-looking creature. His name was Sorom, the leader of this hired army. It made Ra sick to the stomach to think that his superiors in the cult had given the Lionid command of this expedition. If only he knew why the conclave was wasting its coin on paying such a beast to do such delicate work. Ra thought without shame that the Lionid's fame was undeserved. The arduous climb would test the beast's reputation.
Sorom!
He called from a distance. The giant Lionid turned on his beastly mount. His golden lion's mane was covered in frost. His pride impelled him to show it without the protection of the thick fur hood of his long cloak.
Don't you think we're moving too slowly?
The Lionid was tired of the sour monk's constant complaints. He would have liked to reply in kind, but a now familiar sound made him duck down instinctually. Once again, a distinctive whistling sound announced the arrival of another arrow. The company of barbarians raised their shields in a reflexive action, but could not stop the unseen arrow from striking flesh. Yet another of the savage northerners lay writhing on the blanket of snow now stained red with blood. His comrades barely bothered to look at him as he lay there in agony. The lines of men marched past him relentlessly, without averting their gaze from the path ahead. The wall of shields moved on without halting. With the danger past, Sorom raised his head and resumed his conversation with the monk.
Faster! Ra?
He snapped at him with bitterness.
In this weather, and with a sylvan bow over our heads? Pray to your goddess that my men do not choose to mutiny, or these arrows will have fewer throats to choose from.
Ra looked upon the most recent barbarian victim of their unseen aggressor, lying abandoned in the wilderness. He followed the corpse with his eyes until it disappeared into the mist behind him.
Indeed, Sorom, your men are proving invaluable,
he shouted with obvious irony.
Rest assured, we will not get lost on these peaks. All we have to do is follow the trail of the dead we leave behind.
This infuriated the Lionid. With an energetic tug on the bridle, he forced his demon steed to turn towards the monk. When he reached him, he glared into the monk's eyes.
You have no idea what we're up against, old man. No idea at all!
That's your business, Sorom. That's why you're here. I'm just making sure the money the Order spends on you is put to proper use.
Then bite your poisonous tongue, and let me do my job.
Visibly irritated, the mercenary returned to his usual position in the ranks. He addressed his men.
Who has the girl?
Ra couldn't help but feel satisfied. He took a malicious pleasure in driving the beast mad. So far, that seemed to be the only redeeming factor in such a mortifying journey. Ariom leaned his back against the rough stone wall that served as a parapet against the fury of the wind. The string of his bow still vibrated with an imperceptible hum, like that of a musical instrument. The note of death lingered for a little longer, before fading into silence. Ariel reached his position only seconds later and crouched beside him.
"They're still advancing. We're running out of mountain passes from which to ambush them," she said.
"We'll run out of arrows first. There are too many of them, and they will not stop."
The elf reached for his quiver, which held only a handful of arrows. He had barely a dozen left. His eyes returned to the woman.
"The wind is blowing against us. It is very difficult to shoot accurately in this weather. They'll be on us before I've used my last arrow."
Ariom was a Sylvan elf of pure breed, untainted by the blood of other races. He was the pride of his people, the son of the Alsari clan of the Iselshire forests. She was dressed as a priestess. These were no ordinary garments. Her robes were adorned with pleats and accessories of fascinating and intricate design that were clearly of elven craftsmanship. No other race in the world is capable of creating garments with such an exquisite blend of grace and proportion. She was no ordinary priestess either. This was made clear by the intricate runes and markings that were sewn into fabric of her cloak, and the embroidered image of a dragon emblazoned on its back. These markings confirmed she was the servant of a strange and mysterious cult, as powerful as it was mythical. It was one of those sacred and secretive organizations that inspire both fear and respect.
"Gods be damned, sister. Rexor should not have left us."
"The gods are not responsible for our choices, Asim Shah, nor Rexor's, nor mine."
Ariom looked for a moment at the Virgin of Hergos beside him. Her mauve eyes glowed with emotional intensity, contrasting with the pale gold of her skin. Her black hair was streaked with snowflakes, which Ariom took the liberty of brushing aside in a gentle caress. He felt his eyes fall into the tender gaze of the she-elf. She gently clasped his hand with a subtle smile on her lips. There were no words adequate enough to describe her beauty.
"I know that you are here to care for me, Ariom,"
she said with tenderness, gently removing his hand from her hair.
"and that you have done everything in your power to protect us."
The words eased the archer's guilt for a moment. Her soft voice could tame the wildest of beasts. Otherwise, it would be strange indeed for her to be at the side of that savage half-breed who she had made father of her child. Only the gods knew where he was, while they were right here, trying to prevent this host of savages from reaching the peaks of Sacrum.
"Asim Shar!"
shouted a hoarse voice in the distance. It sounded like a deep roar, echoing in the mountains around. The voice jolted them out of their inaction, and they looked at each other in surprise.
"It's Sorum,"
she acknowledged. She would never forget that voice.
"It must be a trap,"
Ariom said warily.
"He's not in such a weak position that he needs to negotiate."
"Sorum is not evil. He's just an opportunist."
Ariom signaled his disagreement with a shake of his head.
"I'll never understand why you insist on seeing the good side in everyone,"
he said with some resignation.
"That Felid, after what he did to you."
"Asim Shar!"
They heard the voice of Sorum roar again,
I heard you, you damn bastard!
Ariom shouted back, though his voice was not as loud as his opponent's.
Tell that old relic Rexer that I want to make a deal with him.
The elf turned his head back to the stone shelter where his beautiful companion waited. Ariel's purple eyes, burning like fire, gazed at the battle-hardened elven scout for a moment.
He thinks Rexor is still with us,
Ariom said.
He wants to make a pact with him. I don't trust him, Ariel, and you shouldn't trust him either.
We must not reveal Rex's absence yet,
she insisted.
He needs time to secure the seals of the Sacrum. Let us give him that. We've already seen that arrows won't stop Sorom. Perhaps words will...
Ariom raised his angular-shaped face above the natural ridge that shielded him from the cold, and received an icy blast from the wind once again.
Hold off your dogs, Sorom. Only then will we listen to you.
He cried loudly. His call was met by silence, only broken by the sound of the wind gusting through the gaps in the rocks around them. Sorom gave the order to halt the advance. The men formed up in the snow, wary of the unseen threat that could unleash a deadly attack at any moment. They were dogs of war, used to obeying a master. Most of them were barbarians, belonging to the northern clans of the Yikter, Volgos, Aryans, and Thorvans from the frozen north. They were mercenaries and raiders, regarded as of low status even among their own kind. They were of hardy stock and cheap to hire. They endured the harsh climate of these parts with fierce fortitude and were prepared to suffer great adversity for a handful of silver aries. They understood well that to gain these riches, others would have to bleed. They would show no mercy or pity to those who got in their way. However, on this occasion, it was their bodies that littered the surrounding landscape. They lay scattered along the narrow trail, cut down by the accuracy of Ariom's deadly elven arrows. They had learned to fear and respect the threat the hidden archer posed.
Stop wasting time, Sorom,
Ra urged sourly. Sorom turned to him, tired of the monk's constant complaining.
Don't you understand yet? We're cornered.
You are trying my patience, Sorom. You have 24 of your northern bastards with us, and we're stuck here like rats in a hole. We paid you to lead us to the Sacrum, not to talk to old men and elves. Order your savages to hunt them down before their arrows finish us all off. We need to get to the temple as fast as possible.
The Lionid looked down at him in clear anger. The hands of the cult soldiers guarding the Reverend slid slowly to their weapons. No one knew what might happen if Sorom was to enter into a state of uncontrolled rage. And Ra seemed to be trying his best to provoke him. Sorom was more than twice the size of the most corpulent barbarian who accompanied him. The Lionid would undoubtedly be a tough opponent to overcome in combat, even though he was officially there as a scholar. But it was not his generous proportions that most disturbed these simple soldiers. It was his unusual appearance. Few can claim to have seen one of these Lionid warriors, even as an illustration in a book. Few even know the word that describes such a unique race, and even fewer know that a Felid is more than a corpulent, muscular body crowned by an extraordinary cat-like head. Knowing that this imposing and fierce creature might not need the weapons he was carrying to dismember the cleric, made him even more worthy of respect and fear.
I don't like being told how to make a living.
Sorom's voice had taken on an aggressive tone.
Then do what you were hired to do!
The monk barked energetically, swaying in the saddle of his horse. Sorom could no longer restrain his anger.
You filthy scum! You rotting, nauseating slug!
He raged, not even glancing at the most courageous cult guards who immediately brought their weapons to bear at his threatening tone.
You have no idea who is harassing us, do you? You have spent far too long in seclusion within the rotten walls of the accursed sanctuaries your cult has built, lavishing false praise upon your divine whore. You are stupid human as well as reckless! These are not old men or elves of any kind, damn you. It is the Sharakolom himself who is out there. He is the one who points his bow at us, the warden of knowledge, whom you so gratuitously call an old man. But what can I expect? Neither you nor your foolish band of servile scum are intelligent enough to realize that you are not safe within 100 paces of a sylvan bow, nor of a dragon virgin with a staff in her hand. And I assure you, accursed lapdog of Kala, that in this place we are desecrating. They are not the worst of our woes.
How dare you, you worthless mercenary!
Silence, you bastard!
Sorum roared.
Whether you like it or not, I am still in command of this expedition, and what I command will be done.
The terrible size of his jaws and their sharp ivory teeth chilled the blood of the bravest warrior. As he continued speaking, the Felid did not hide his contempt for the monks led by Ra.
If my methods do not satisfy you, Monsignor, then I urge you to inform your superiors, the same ones who considered my presence indispensable in this mission. Perhaps they will be able to give you appropriate explanations. And perhaps I will take the opportunity to express my views on your contribution to this venture.
The cleric bit his lip and swallowed his pride. The Lionid would have the upper hand in a confrontation between them. From his vantage point, Sorum looked up at the peaks above him. He caught a glimpse of the ancient Temple of Sacrum, silhouetted against the craggy rocks around it. It seemed to defy time and legend in its perilous location.
The shrine is not far,
Sorum announced in apparent calm.
If you and your handful of minions wish to live long enough to reach it, shut up and do as I command. Rest assured, we will need more men than you can imagine, Ra.
The sinister monk was incandescent with rage, but he knew he was at a disadvantage. He hated this glorified artifact seeker with an unwavering passion, but he needed the arcane knowledge that only the Lionid could provide. Much as he wanted to, Ra could not ignore Sorom's skills and abilities, for which the Lionid was highly regarded in the eyes of the cult leadership. Nor, of course, could he dispense with the band of brutal northern mercenaries Sorum had brought with him. Even if the monk felt they had been wasted in the hands of the arrogant Lionid, despite the criticisms made against Sorum, the cult valued the unique services provided by the Felid. After this expedition, they would value him even more, no matter how much it might make the Reverend's blood boil. So, he had to be careful. Perhaps there would be another opportunity for revenge. Maybe when it was all over. When the sacrum was in the possession of the arcane lictors and cryptors of his goddess. When the chalice had served its purpose, bringing the Reaper Nemesis from the depths of the pit to summon his legions. It would herald the beginning of a new era, which would at last cease to be a prophetic and unattainable dream. Perhaps then this disrespectful non-believer, this despicable cat-faced digger of antiquities, would finally be punished, as was deserved.
Let's finish this. Bring me the girl,
the Lionid demanded. The monk waited with obvious impatience. From the hands of one of the sturdy Northmen, Sorum took a small bundle of wrapped furs, which he cradled in his wide embrace. For a moment, a faint hint of tenderness appeared on his noble lion's face that was covered with flecks of ice and snow. Inside that small wad of skins dozed a little girl, lying like a priceless jewel, unaware and innocent of all that was happening. She was no more than a tiny pale-skinned baby, with triangular-shaped pointed ears. Her angelic face displayed a vision of peace and contentment that seems to inhabit every sleeper. It must have been that which wrenched a moment of compassion from the Lionid's normally impassive beast-like features. But the moment of weakness passed as quickly as it had appeared. Sorum lifted the fragile little body into the air and held it in front of his lion-like head. He exposed the child to the cold wind, and to the elven eyes that were observing him from behind the mist-covered rocks.
I offer you a trade, Rexor. Surrender and I will return the witch's daughter,
he announced. Although his eyes saw no one, he knew he was being watched.
You should accept, or the child will die.
Ariel, he has your daughter.
Ariom exclaimed, turning his distraught face towards the elven priestess. Her eyes went wide with alarm at the unwelcome news. Leaping from her hiding place, she stood at the archer's side and watched the scene unfold, just a few hundred paces in front of them. The Felid held the small bundle against its chest. She recognized it instantly.
Almighty Hergos, it is Ariel.
Ariel.
The archer hastened to intervene.
What if it's a trap? We don't know if what's under those skins is really your little child.
It is her, Asim Shah. Believe me, I can feel it.
Ariom knew from past experience that his beautiful companion's intuition was never wrong. Her certainty that this was her daughter was enough to convince him that it was an irrefutable fact.
If there is no other choice, I will finish him off at your signal.
That's not a good idea, Ariom. I know Sorom means her no harm. He only wants to take advantage of the situation.
The Virgin Dorai argued with an unexpected calmness in her words.
But if he falls, I can't be sure the clerics of Kala will be so merciful.
I understand.
The elf sighed.
No more charades. The time has come to show our faces. Prepare yourself, sister.
Rexor! Look what your cowardice is forcing me to do!
The Felid shouted across the field of snow. Ra still doubted the usefulness of all these theatrics.
I mean her no harm, Rexor. But I cannot allow you to get in the way again. Your actions will make you an accomplice to a misfortune I do not wish to happen. Come, show your face at once.
Sorom scanned the misty Arctic scene before him with his eyes, but there was no sign of movement. All his men were nervous. They were in the middle of nowhere, ravaged by the cold and harassed by an unseen enemy. They had discovered with bitterness that those arrows were able to find the tiny gaps in their shield wall. Their rugged bearded faces, covered with scars and war paint, dared not peer out from the useless protection of their defenses. They stared at each other in fear, their heavy breathing exhaling clouds of mist from their lungs. They hoped that the phantom spitting arrows at them would choose another target in their place. Sorom was about to play his last card. Only the moaning of the wind ripping through the crevices in the mountains broke the sullen, tense silence. Perhaps even the threat of hurting the baby was not enough to bring out his rival. But then, the phantom showed his face. The other warriors wouldn't have noticed the figure rising from the rocks if one of the Thorvins had not alerted them. He pointed his finger through the mist and shouted a word in the harsh tongue of the mountains. Ra watched as the group of barbarians stirred as one. They were impatient for action. He glanced back at his own escort and motioned for them to prepare their bows. The cult soldiers began to obey. Sorom spotted the furtive movements behind him that were clearly intended to go unnoticed. He soon understood the intentions of this band of insolent monks. Without moving a muscle in his face, he spoke to Ra in a low, whispered voice.
If any of your men act without my permission, Monsignor, I will have my Thorvins disembowel them, and you will suffer the same fate. Of course, I will receive a reduction in my fee if none of you return alive. But believe me, it is a price I am willing to pay.
Ra silently cursed the Felid, who seemed to have eyes in the back of his head. Reluctantly, he ordered his men to return their arrows to their quivers. Through the thick curtain of icy mist, a humanoid figure emerged and walked slowly towards the band of monks and warriors. It walked calmly, as if unconcerned by the men that had been slaughtered at its hands. It wielded a long staff, the ornate end of which glittered among the thousands of snowflakes that were whipped around it by the fierce wind from the peaks. Sorom knew immediately that it was not Rexor. There was no doubt about it. The outline of the shadow advancing towards the men became more detailed and clearer as it approached them, until at last it revealed its true nature. Ariel wore the exotic Dorai robes of the virgins of Hergos, the father of magic, the dragon god. Her slim, delicate figure swayed gracefully in perfect rhythm with her steps as she glided forward across the snow. As she cautiously approached the group of men, she held out her staff menacingly towards them. The long, dark ebony hair of the beautiful elven woman was visible from the sides of the ornate white hood that capped her ermine cloak. It covered her head, shading her finely sculptured features from the gaze of any curious onlookers. At some distance from the group, the sorceress paused. Seeing that their foe was standing defiantly in front of them, the barbarians brandished their weapons and prepared to charge. Seeing the agitation in his men, Sorom turned and roared at them in their harsh northern tongue. The barbarians reluctantly held themselves back, reined in by the order from their master. They could be heard grumbling, but moved no further. Sorom turned his eyes back to the elf. From the focused expression on her face, he could see that she expected to be attacked at any moment. Sorom tried to appear calm. He knew very well that the fragile-looking woman before him was not to be underestimated.
Ariel?
He called her name in his deep, powerful voice.
It is an unexpected pleasure to find you in these ravaged lands, but it is not you I seek.
She held the lion's gaze. Even Ra was now wary of this sublime and self-assured female who dared to face a whole horde of savages alone.
Give me my daughter, Sorom. I accept your offer,
she said with a firmness in her voice that made one forget her usual gentle tone.
If you harm her, you will die here and now.
Sorom took the warning seriously, but he was determined to be firm in this negotiation. Trying to appear nonchalant, he unwrapped the bundle he was holding and allowed his mother to see the delicate features of her tiny baby. A beautiful little girl with soft white hair was lying within the furs and blankets that enveloped her. She looked healthy and alert. The child's clumsy little hands tried to grasp the air in front of her, blissfully unaware of the perilous situation she was in. It had the effect that the mercenary had hoped for. Ariel's resolve seemed to break at the sight of her daughter. She tried to look composed, but she could barely hide her despair.
She has your eyes, no doubt. She takes after you,
the giant Phalid said, referring to the baby's fine and delicate features. The gentle expression on Sorom's face quickly dissipated into a grimace of determination as he drew a huge knife from his belt and held it out in front of the innocent creature.
It would be a shame for this child to bear the marks of this day. Don't you think, sister?
He roared at the beautiful elf, turning up the heat of the confrontation. She flinched in a sign of uncharacteristic weakness.
Don't hurt her, Sorom, I beg you.
The threat had worked. The mercenary was still in a position of power.
Please don't hurt her. I know you. You are not a murderer.
Then don't force me to become one, Ariel!
Sorom looked around him as if searching for someone else.
Now! Tell the Sharakolam to show himself.
The sorceress hesitated for a moment.
I know he has an arrow with my name on it. Bring him out. Now!
The blade of the knife came dangerously close to the little girl's face. Ariel begged him to stop. Sorom managed to maintain an expression of ruthless determination on his face. Even Ra was beginning to appreciate the methods of that infidel, Lionid bastard.
You win, Sorom.
A male voice was heard through the curtains of driving snow. All heads turned in the direction it had come from. A shadowy figure appeared in the distance. Ariom's lean, wiry body soon came into view. He strode forward with a proud, confident swagger, his shoulders swaying rhythmically from side to side as he walked. The imperious bearing of an elf, no doubt. The distinctive green color of his dragon-scale armor could be glimpsed beneath the folds of the bulky furs that covered him. Strapped to his back was a collection of spears in a loose quiver. The broad-headed steel points extended well above his shoulder, like the mast of a shipwrecked galleon. Behind them rested a magnificent, broadly shaped kite shield. These were the weapons of the hunter, the ones with which he had forged his legend. But it was not the spears that struck fear into the hearts of the veteran marauders. He held the deadly bow casually between his fingers, an arrow resting on the curved wood, which was adorned with ornate and intricate carvings. The feathered base of the arrow was fixed to the bowstring, its deadly point turned harmlessly towards the snow-covered ground. But no one doubted that it could be aimed and released at a moment's notice with deadly accuracy.
"Here's the arrow with your name on it, you insolent bastard,"
he said as he halted in front of the barbarian host. The Thorvins stared at the bow with unbridled hatred. They had spent long hours trying to elude murderous arrowheads that had harried their advance. Each arrow missing from that quiver represented a lost compatriot lying dead in the slough.
Good. That's better. Lovely reunion of old acquaintances.
The Felid chuckled at the spearman's arrival.
Now all that remains is for our master of ceremonies to appear, dear sister. Tell Rexer to come out too. Or will you continue to let that old man play with your daughter's life?
"Rexer is not with us,"
Ariom insisted. Sorom turned to him with mocking condescension.
What kind of fool do you take me for, Hunter? I know very well that Rexor is with you.
It is true, Sorom. Rexer is not here. We have been separated. Only Ariom and I have made it this far.
The news seemed to take the Felid off guard, and he didn't know how to react. He was somewhat unsettled and paused for a moment of reflection. If true, he was wasting precious time, while the Warden of Knowledge might be ahead of them. It irritated him. Like a fool, he had fallen for an old trick.
If that is so, sister, we are done with this conversation.
With lightning speed, Ariom drew his bow and aimed the arrow at Sorom. The Lionid had no time to react and found himself at the mercy of the elven hunter.
"Not a step, Sorom. Don't even think about moving."
The barbarians nearby brandished their weapons and prepared to defend their master. Sorom stayed frozen in place. "Do it, and I'll pierce your beast head without batting an eyelid."
Ariom, stop!
The she-elf shouted, trying to place herself between Ariom's bow and Sorom.
"We'll do this my way, sister."
The Sharakolom's ashen pupils were locked on his target.
Are you going to shoot me, Ariom? Will you? With the child in my arms?
All the fighting men stood ready and waited for the moment to act. Adrenaline pumped through their veins by the gallon, their muscles tensed as they prepared to burst into action.
"Is this a gamble, Sorom? You want to gamble? I bet you'll be dead before you fall off that monster you're riding. What do you say?"
Ra took the opportunity to make a furtive hand gesture to his armed men. They understood the intention of the priest, and slowly took up their bows again.
Free my daughter, Sorom.
The sorceress implored.
I will be your prisoner, and the Sharakolom will return to where he came from. I give you my word.
"Return the child to her mother, Sorom, and you will live to blackmail someone else."
Sorom hesitated. Perhaps. For a moment it looked like the situation had calmed, that perhaps an agreement could be arranged. But tension still filled the air. It would only need a spark to ignite the smoldering embers of conflict that were starting to cool. A spark that would turn the situation into a raging bonfire again. And the spark would be ignited in a way that no one expected.
Ankara! Ankara!
A cry of terror filled the air, like a blood-curdling howl. One of the giant Volgos looked up at the sky, pointing his finger in the air. The expression on the savage's tattooed face was unmistakable. The Thorvans looked to the horizon above the snow-covered peaks, their eyes wide open in terror. The worst of their nightmares was about to come true.
"Gods protect us,"
thought Ariom, for whom the very concept of asking protection was unthinkable. Instinctively, he looked away for a moment. When he looked back, he witnessed a scene of chaos, as terrified men broke ranks and fled in all directions. Ariom tried to keep his aim fixed on Sorom, but the unpredictable movement of the panicked men in front of him obscured his view. He couldn't get a fix on his target. The monstrous mount of the Lionid reared up on its hind quarters, unnerved by the hysterical reaction of the men around it. Ariom tried to compose himself and concentrate his aim. Suddenly, An ominous hiss passed a short distance from his neck. It was too close to be ignored. The archer shifted his aim and identified the threat. One of the cult riders had just shot at him with his bow. Two more also released their arrows at him. Instinctively, he let himself drop to the ground. The arrows flew past his body and planted in the ground behind him. Fortunately, these soldiers did not have his expertise. He rolled over in the wet snow and let loose his arrow. The projectile struck one of the cult soldiers under his helmet and pierced his throat, sending him tumbling from his horse. He lay still on the snow. Before Ariom knew it, a handful of barbarians were upon him.
Hurry! Ra! Let's get out of here! You have to leave now if you value your miserable life!
The Felid shouted over the din of men fleeing in panic.
What's going on?
The monk looked puzzled, as did the cult soldiers who served him.
You don't want to know, old man. You!
He pointed at one of the barbarians who had managed to maintain his composure. Sorom tossed the child to him, and the northern man caught her.
Guard this child with your life.
His hands now free, the Lionid gripped the bridle of his monstrous mount and spurred him to a gallop.
I will wait for no one, Ra!
The demon steed charged forward, crushing and trampling everything and everyone in its path. Ra and the other monks wasted no time in following the Felid's example. Ariel instinctively launched herself in pursuit of the barbarian who fled with her little girl. Soon he was lost in the tide of men rushing in all directions. Ariom had no intention of fighting the savages from the Yictor. He had other priorities. He skillfully dodged attacks from the enemy combatants and tried to weave his way among them. At the same time, he grabbed one of his long spears, and Defly skewered one of his assailants. He pulled out the 4 inches of steel that had pierced the hide and protection of the giant warrior who stood in his way. The iron tip exited the wound, bathed in blood. With a swift movement, the elven hunter dodged the colossus as he collapsed heavily to the snow-covered ground. And he continued to dodge and weave among the mass of men. For a brief moment, he looked away from his opponents and looked up to the snow-filled sky. A sinister winged silhouette of monstrous dimensions appeared above him. Maybe there was still time. Not much, but maybe enough. Ariom managed to break through the mass of disorganized warriors who soon gave up their pursuit of the elusive elf. Without their master to marshal them, they preferred to flee for their lives. He raised his spear and prepared to throw it, instinctively calculating the optimal angle of its trajectory. The cult horsemen turned their horses and galloped away from him, but they were not his target. He was after the beast that rode ahead of them. It was moving away at great speed. It would be a difficult shot, but Ariom's name was legend. The huge projectile sliced through the air, moving inexorably with speed and power towards its target. No one saw it coming. The spear accelerated as the wind seemed to grip it and guide it on its way. Its deadly steel point searched for a heart to pierce. However, it only grazed the Felid's back. It pierced his cloak that was billowing in the wind before planting itself harmlessly in the ground. Sorom looked back as he felt his cloak rip and saw how close to death he'd come. His formidable mount was at the head of the cult horsemen fleeing in desperation. Sorom's eyes squinted through the falling snow and found the figure of the elven hunter standing far behind him, now out of range. Ariom's face was a mask of rage. He had missed his best chance, and Sorom was still alive. The hunter gave up his pursuit of the Lionid. He grabbed another spear and tried to find the warrior who was holding the baby. He turned around and ran after the mass of fleeing barbarians. Ariel found herself among the panicked warriors, distraught at having lost sight of her daughter. She paused for a moment to scan the chaotic scene around her. She almost didn't see him coming. He threw himself at her, wildly swinging his enormous battle axe, trying to split her in two. She turned just in time and managed to parry the blow with her dragon staff. The barbarian could hardly believe it when he saw his formidable blade shattering into pieces on impact with the sorceress's staff. His tattooed face stared in disbelief at the broken stump of the weapon in his hand. The sorceress reacted with lightning speed. In one swift stroke, the woman's open palm struck the chest of the muscular warrior. The barbarian was thrown back at great velocity and crashed into a tree behind him. She felt herself lifted off her feet, interrupting her powerful incantation. She felt a gust of air around her, and then a great wave of heat. Something with a colossal wingspan appeared out of nowhere, whipping up a whirlwind in its wake. She was only barely aware of flying through the air before landing hard on the snow below. There was a thunderous roar, as if it came from the depths of the mountains themselves, and a tremor. The wounded earth. The mountains seemed to groan as tons of flesh and scale burst among the horde of frightened men like the keel of a ship crashing through a wave. Its claws were like harpoons made of polished, gleaming ebony. They dug deep into the ground as a massive living form came to rest. All around it, the barbarians cried in terror and tried to flee from the colossus that had dropped from the sky. And there he was, the lord of these peaks. They all knew it. He had come to reclaim his territory. There was no doubt about it. He was truly worthy of the legend he had inspired. He was Ankahra, lord of the Enatu, dragon of dragons. He easily measured over 100 feet from the tip of his tail to the highest point of his spiked head. His dragon's jaws were huge, and his cranium was studded with horns, which were as long as spears. The massive beast reached a height of nearly 30 feet. The fearsome black dragon oozed power from every pore. His scales creaked with the slightest movement. They moved and folded like the plates of the finest armor. His muscles, like stone capable of movement, twitched and flexed as its huge, lean body shifted position with incredible agility. He wasted little time glancing at the little creatures scattering around him in panic. His serpentine neck lunged at the nearest to him. His unfortunate victim did not even have a chance to react before the jaws opened, and the dragon's long, crested neck sprung out towards its prey. The barbarian felt a terrible fear grip him. But it only lasted for a second. It was the last thing he saw before the jaws and razor-sharp teeth closed round his fragile body. He felt its thick metallic breath, and a wave of overbearing humidity close around him. He had no chance to scream. He didn't even feel pain. There was a thunderous rumble as the ancient dragon's feet crushed the earth below them. Ariel was only slightly dazed. She blinked, and her eyes cleared enough to see the carnage unfolding before her. Ankahra was tearing the fleeing men apart, devouring them like a hungry wolf trapped in a henhouse. His claws tore into flesh and his teeth dismembered those who did not manage to flee in time. A terrible thought passed through Ariel's mind. Ariom! That barbarian might still be here. The priestess was overwhelmed by a terrible sense of dread. She prayed that the man from the north might be safe, but she was too close to the eye of the storm. She spun round, sensing that she was in grave danger. Before she knew it, a torrent of magma was spewing out from the dragon's mouth towards her. Ariel raised her arms in desperation. A wall of ice rose in front of her, blocking the deadly stream of fire. She barely escaped the reach of the flames, which impacted against the magical wall and melted it into watery ice. This new intriguing prey and amazing abilities had caught the old dragon's attention. He soon forgot about the other little creatures around him who were desperately fleeing for their lives.